Well, a very warm welcome to this How To Academy event. My name is Matt Stadlen. I'm a presenter on LBC, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Jelmer Mommers, who's a Dutch climate change journalist. He's written this best-selling book that now has been translated into English. How are we going to explain this? And I guess the whole principle of this book is how will we explain ourselves, that's you and me and Jelmer and others, to future generations if we don't get this sorted, if we don't make the planet somewhere that we can continue to live on. That's the crux of the book. It's very well written, it's brilliantly translated, and I'm very excited that so many of you are joining us from around the world. It's absolutely sweltering here in London. I've just had to go and change my top because it was getting wet and there were patches everywhere. I don't know whether that's appropriate or ironic, but listen, Jelmer, it's great to have you with us. Are you in Amsterdam at the moment?
Yeah, I'm based in Amsterdam, and I think we're experiencing the same heat wave, more or less. So the room I'm in is 30 degrees and then a bit, and it's been absolutely ridiculous the last past days, the amount of heat, and it's just, yeah, it's very clear that we're living in a climate emergency.
Well, I was going to say, before you set out the book, the gist of the book, in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just give us a sense of why you wrote it and what went into it. It's probably important to differentiate between climate and weather, because when Donald Trump, as you say in the book, says things like, oh, there's so much snow, it's so cold in New York, of course there can't be a climate emergency, we mock him. And yet you're using the heat wave at the moment as an example of climate change. So just untangle that for us.
Yeah, well, the point is, so climate change is actually about, it's about warming, right? It's not change in both directions. It's about the planet getting warmer every decade for the past decades, and every year is almost getting warmer than the past. And the hottest years on record have been the past 5. And so that's the climate. That's the average weather over 30 years. But actually, if you look at things like heat waves, for instance, those are actually weather events. But the point is that heat waves get more frequent, and they get more probable, and they get more severe, and they get hotter, and they last longer in a hotter climate. So one of the effects of climate change is more heat waves. Actually, one of the best, one of the effects that's most evidenced. And so that's why I just said, like, this heat wave is just another example of there being climate change, because there may have been a heat wave like this if we hadn't changed the climate, us as humanity, but the chances of it happening as often, as hot, and as frequent are just very, very, very small. So that's one of the cues that you can actually, see the weather change as a sign of climate change.
I'm just fascinated, again, this is something you touched on in the book, how very, very cold winters can be consistent with climate change.
Yeah, well, they don't make the general trend. They don't reverse the trend. So one winter doesn't reverse the trend of global warming, which has been going on for decades and for over 150 years. So one very cold day does not refute the theory of climate change, and especially not the practice of it, because it's not actually a theory. It's something that we've measured. It's something that we're living in. And for hundreds of millions of people, it's their day-to-day reality. It's they're living through heat waves. They are living through flash floods, through all sorts of natural disasters, which have gotten worse. They were exacerbated by us changing the climate.
So we know that extreme weather conditions can be examples, instantiations of climate change, but you're not going as far as to say that very, very cold weather is such an example. It's just that cold winters can happen despite generalized climate change.
Right, and then there are theories, for instance, so I mentioned in the book the very cold winter that Donald Trump tweeted about a couple of years ago, where he said, well, you see, climate change is not happening. But then there were actually theories that there is a certain oscillation around the North Pole, which has been changed due to the global warming, which actually makes weather from the Arctic drop sometimes to Northern America or to Western Europe. So actually, there are people saying that you can even attribute these cold patches of weather in New York, for instance, to climate change. But
so let's start at the beginning then. why did you write the book? I mean, it's kind of been 5 years in the making, not 5 years in the writing, but in the researching and the preparing. Why did you choose to do that? And what would you say is the overarching message? Because quite early on, you say that we're in unbelievably deep shit. And I'm using your words or the translated words. But there is some optimism, there is hope as well.
There is. I mean, the reason for me to write this book is actually I was talking to a friend of mine. His name is Tom. And we were having coffee and we were discussing climate change. And Tom told me he is in complete despair. And he actually gave me 3 very good reasons. He said, you know, climate change is happening. It's causing so much trouble already, and it will become much worse. But one, he said, governments are not doing enough. You know, they know this problem is happening. They're not making enough policy by far. Then there's businesses who, by and large, are still investing in fossil fuels, who are still making the problem worse. And third, there are individuals and consumers, citizens the world over, who even when they know this problem is happening, and even when they know that their consumption is causing more climate change, they continue their behavior all the same. So he said these 3 reasons for him, this analysis caused him to just resign and just think, I actually am going to look away from now on. So he made sort of a conscious choice to say, this problem is just too large for me. We're never going to solve it, and I don't want to be looking at it much longer. So he chose to look away. And I think actually a lot of people make that choice, make that decision, because the news about climate change is so dire and it continues to get worse that, you know, it's actually the most attractive solution is to just look away. And my book is an attempt to show everyone who's looking away. And by the way, I myself do that sometimes because I too get very sad and depressed when I read all the news about the climate. And I try to show myself, my friend Tom, and everyone who's reading the book, there's actually another way to look at this problem. And it's through understanding that already we've known about this problem for decades, and we've also made small steps to solving it. And actually, we've never been in a moment where we have had such good options and such great technologies and such political momentum to actually solve this crisis. It's never been this easy. And actually, so the main thesis of the book, after I describe how we got into trouble and where we could go from here, I actually describe what people can do themselves. And I think every individual can help to make this crisis smaller and to make the earth more livable for future generations and for ourselves.
Yes, I don't think there are likely to be very many climate change deniers or skeptics listening in this evening. I don't see why people would bother if that was their view, but there are probably quite a few Toms who think this is just beyond our control. There's nothing we can do about it, and are skeptical as to whether we can change things for the better. At the end of the book, I want to sort of, in a way, take our next step with a giant leap forward, because you address 9 or 10 points that are often made by people, whether they are deniers or whether they're skeptics like Tom as to what we can do about it. And just very briefly, I want to go through those points because they're quite eye-opening and they're helpful. I mean, often when I try to tackle climate change on my LBC show, I come up against deniers and skeptics. And it can be quite tricky to rebut them very straightforwardly. And you help us do that at the end of the book. So the first point that you raise is those who say that climate change, well, it always changes. The climate is always changing. It's always changed. There have been ice ages and so forth.
Yeah.
So what's different about this? And what's your answer, very simply?
Well, it's true that we've always had ice ages, or at least for the past 2.6 million years that we know about. We've always had ice ages and warmer intermediate periods. And that's one of the ones we're in now. But the point is that we've never had climate change like this fast, never caused by us, by humans, as right now. And we've never had it while there were 7.8 billion people living on the planet who could be hurt by extreme weather, who could be hurt by more flooding, by more sea level rise, etc., etc. So the situation is completely different. And saying that the climate has changed before is like saying that the temperature of your car has changed before right after you set it on fire. You know, we're in a completely different situation. We have never been in this situation. And actually humanity And civilization as we know it has thrived for the past 10,000 years in a relatively stable climate. It was actually relatively unique for as far as we know, and it enabled us to begin growing crops, to begin cultivating crops and build societies as we know them today. And we're now leaving that sweet spot in which civilization came about and then thrived. So actually, the fact that there were ice ages and there were even hotter periods far, far back shouldn't be an excuse to do nothing. Actually, it should make us even more worried, because right now we're causing a climate change that is so fast and frankly unprecedented that we should be very worried, especially about the historical proxies we have of very hot periods, because a hothouse Earth, I mean, it has existed before and it's not very livable. And a lot of people, hundreds of millions of people who are now living around the equator will not be able to live there if that's where we go. And I'm not saying that we will reach such a hothouse Earth. That's really a far out scenario where we're not, we won't reach that in 5 or 10 years. I'm not someone who believes in the climate apocalypse, but we are tending that way. And it will continue to get worse if we don't do much more to solve this.
Just to pick up on that point, that you're not someone who believes in the climate apocalypse, you do distinguish between serious man-made climate change and Armageddon.
Right.
Broadly speaking, how bad do you think things are likely to get if we do nothing? Because if I have a conversation with a friend and I say that we've got 10 years to solve this, or 20 years to solve this. I mean, there are even books out at the moment. I think Jonathan Porritt, who I interviewed, I think his book is something about 10 years, called something like 10 years to save the planet. What is the worst case scenario? What does that mean tangibly? Because people who think they should care about it don't necessarily always know, and even very well educated and caring people don't really know why they should care about it.
Well, the worst case scenario is that we continue to not care about it and do too little. And then we will just get in a progressively worse situation every time. Every year will be, or almost every year will be worse than the one before.
But what does that look like, Jelmer, in I don't know, 2100? What does that actually, what does that mean for human beings?
Well, it means actually that the people who are well off now will have to build giant fortresses around their houses or giant walls around their countries to shield themselves from, for example, climate refugees, if they want to continue to live in the luxurious bubbles of comfort that they live in now. It means that people who are poor right now, vulnerable, marginalized, will be even poorer and even more marginalized, and they will be hit by all the most serious problems that we can think of. And so it will become uninhabitable, the Earth as we know it, in the sense that at least civilization as we know it will no longer be able to continue. Now I understand that it's very abstract, but take one specific example, take farming, right? Take agriculture. Our civilization has been able to develop thanks to agriculture, thanks to the fact that we can raise crops and keep animals, right? Keep livestock. But actually, when it's too hot, the crops that we eat now grow less well. When there's more storms, when there's more drought, and all those other effects of climate change, our production of agriculture goes down. Animals like cows, pigs, and all the other animals that we keep as livestock, they can't live just as us. They can't live in terrible heat waves. And so just if you look at the food production system, the effects on that system alone will be so disastrous that it will have knock-on effects in every part of society. And of course, the point is that if you're very rich, you're probably able to shield yourself from a lot of those effects. But if you're very poor, you cannot. So I think the worst case scenario is that climate change will make inequality much worse, and it will make life on Earth hellish for hundreds of millions of people. And I just can't believe that we would go that far, that we would let that happen, if we can still change right now. And we can, we still have the chance to make it better, and actually to make a more sustainable, more thriving civilization with, all sorts of benefits, with cleaner air, with more economic equality. And it's just, to my mind, it's just a no-brainer that we should do that.
You talk in the book about how interconnected the natural world is. You talk about the bacteria in our gut that allows us to digest our food. And there's an analogy, I suppose, with COVID. COVID has taught us just how interconnected we are, how reliant we are on each other, and the domino effect from human to human. If one of us is sick, what do you think we've learned from the coronavirus crisis that can help us in our fight against climate change?
Well, like you said, I think we've learned that we are completely interconnected. We're very vulnerable. And that actually some of the worst effects are not the first effects. So, I mean, the majority of people who will not get COVID or hasn't got it yet, I don't know what will happen in the coming months and years, but the majority of the population in most countries has not had this disease yet. Now, from the people who do get it, most of the people are fine. You know, a lot of people don't even notice. And then there's a small percentage who gets very sick, and then there's a smaller percentage who dies. So that's in itself is a terrible situation, and we've had lockdowns and all sorts of interruptions to our normal life as a result. But actually, it's not just, you know, those first order effects on our health. It's what did it do to the economy, right? What did these lockdowns do to the economy? What does it mean for the world to not be able to travel, for instance, all of a sudden? And there are all sorts of knock-on effects, which actually may be worse than the first effect. And the same goes for climate change. So take, for instance, heat waves. You know, you can think, well, it's very hot. It's very hot right now here where I am in Amsterdam, where you are in London. And that may be uncomfortable. But actually, when heat waves get too bad, and like worse than they are now, there's a point where they are bad for your health, they are bad for your sleep, they are bad for your focus. Some of these effects we're already seeing. People get angry more easily when it's too hot. There are all sorts of secondary effects. And if, for instance, if water in rivers is too hot, then electricity companies can't use that water to cool their electricity facilities. So like their coal plants or their gas plants. Things like that. So there are all sorts of secondary effects that actually make these disruptions caused by climate change much worse.
Let's go back to your table of myth busting at the end. And the second question that you answer on behalf of skeptics is this idea that we don't know, well, climate change is happening, but we don't know that it's being caused by our greenhouse gases. So just explain again in synopsis how we know.
Well, we know because greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, like nitrous oxide, and methane, they retain warmth in the atmosphere. We know that from experiments. It's not a theory, you can just test it. And it has been tested, by the way, in the late 19th century already. So we understand that very well. We also know that we're raising the concentration of these greenhouse gases by human activities. For instance, by burning fossil fuels or keeping livestock. So there's no question about that. And then there's like measurements that show us that, well, actually around the world, both on land and in the ocean, temperatures are going up. And so you don't have to be, you know, a rocket scientist to get this. In the most basic form, it's very simple. More greenhouse gases equals a hotter climate, and that's exactly what we've been seeing. And yeah, I think there's actually, the point is there's no dispute about this, not among serious climate scientists or, you know, among the vast majority of the public and even the vast majority of politicians. More or less everybody understands this, I guess.
And this idea that it doesn't matter what we do in Britain or in Holland unless China and India act. So we might as well not do anything. Your answer to that? Well,
it's true that, you know, I think the best way to look at it, and that's what I write in the book, is you can imagine the atmosphere being a bathtub. And I need to explain that analogy actually. But the idea is that if you want to stop a bathtub from overflowing, you need to turn off all the taps that are pouring water into it. And right now, India is pouring water into the bathtub. China is doing it. The US is doing it. Britain is doing it. All countries are emitting greenhouse gases. And the only way to stop that bathtub from overflowing, stop the concentration of greenhouse gases being too high, is to turn all the taps off. So it really doesn't matter who begins. to get where we want to be, which is a stabilization and then a reduction of the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we need to turn all the taps off. Now, in a minute, I want to say something about China and India, who are like the countries of choice to point at when people say there's not being enough done. But first about the bathtub itself, the analogy, you can think of the atmosphere as this giant reservoir in which we pour greenhouse gases, and people tend to think of the universe as like endless. And if you look at the sky, there's like, you can see the end, right? So it feels like it's so vast, it will be impossible for people to change that. But actually, greenhouse gases are like this very thin layer around the Earth. It's very close to the Earth. And that's actually where greenhouse gases stay. And carbon dioxide, for instance, can stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So it's like drinking a beer, raising the percentage of alcohol in your blood, but having the effects of that for hundreds of years, right? You won't be hungover for a while. First, you'll still be intoxicated. And the same is true for what we're doing to the climate. We're adding so much greenhouse gases, unbelievable amounts. It's very, I try to come up with like a comparison in my book for the amount of greenhouse gases we pump into the air. And it's just very hard to find an analogy. There's no object on Earth that is as heavy as the 42 billion tons of carbon we emit every year. It's just an unbelievable amount. And so yeah, to change that, every ton of carbon we do not emit matters. Because that reservoir, that atmosphere is it's the memory of our emissions. It keeps track. And so every ton of carbon we do not emit matters. So it doesn't matter to begin. That doesn't matter. It matters only that we reduce emissions. Now, then a lot of people will say, yeah, but China, they're building so many coal plants. And it's true that actually, even in response to the corona crisis, China has gone back to coal companies and said, can you build new plants to produce more economic growth in the short term? And that's very unfortunate. But actually, when you look at the bigger picture and you look who is investing most in sustainable energy, it's been China for a long time, only then followed by the European countries and then the US. So actually, most of the time, it's more useful to look at ourselves, even ourselves as individual consumers in the West. Probably most of the people watching this, our carbon footprint comparably is so much bigger than that of any Chinese person, that it's much more useful and sensible to look at ourselves first.
Let's look at our politicians then, because again, you dispel this idea that it's pointless for us to take individual action if so many of our politicians seem not to be grasping the problem, or if they do grasp the problem, they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah, well, I think both within and outside of politics, the group of people who really want to do something about this is much bigger than the group of people who just wants to, look away and do nothing. The problem is that the populists, especially, who do not want to do anything about climate change, are very loud and very visible. But there's a vast group of people who has actually gotten the message a long time ago and is working in all sorts of ways to change the path we're on. And so actually, that's why when you ask me, what's the worst case scenario in your mind? That's actually a scenario that I don't believe will happen. I mean, I know for a fact that climate change will get worse before it gets better. That's just a result of physics and the fact that we've got so many, cars on the road, ships on the sea, airplanes in the sky, which will continue to pollute for a little while longer before they are, changed by different technologies or just gotten rid of. And so it will become worse before it gets better, but actually a worst case scenario, as in like just us sort of falling off a staircase into hell, is just not very realistic, because there's such a big group of people already doing stuff about it. And actually, if you look in the financial sector, if you look at the energy sector, if you look in politics, or in the food sector, there's all sorts of changes already going on and all sorts of people working on solutions. And actually, the one solution that I find most inspiring and that is giving us the best chance to, the best fighting chance, is probably sustainable energy and especially solar energy, which has gotten so much cheaper over the last decades. that actually at some point people who do not care about sustainability at all will still buy solar panels for on their roof because it's just so much cheaper.
So let's talk about affordability, the financial side of this, because you address that as well. And you address the question that some people pose, well, we'd be wasting the money that we're investing in trying to combat climate change if climate change isn't really happening. That's the first point. And the second point, you address those who say we simply can't afford it, full stop.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, I just can't believe how untrue these statements are. I mean, I'll begin with the second one, right? Just we can't pay for it. The International Energy Agency, it's a well-known sort of organ for producing all sorts of reports and stuff about energy and climate change. They've actually calculated that if we spend a little bit over 1% of global GDP in the next 3 years on a green recovery from the corona crisis, then we can actually make that green recovery a reality. We can lower emissions, get more jobs, get people who don't have access to electricity right now, give them access to electricity, and it will just have benefits all over, and it will spur economic growth. So this idea that it's very expensive is just not true, because the fact is that it's much more expensive to let climate change happen than to address it. And that has been true for as long as we know about the problem, actually. I mean, I think it was 2006 when in the UK there was this very authoritative report about the cost of climate change by Nicholas Stern, the economist. And he already said that it will be much cheaper to actually tackle this problem than to just leave it happen. And the reason is very simple. I mean, heat waves are very expensive. The effects they have on agriculture are very expensive. Rising sea levels, you know, raising dikes is very expensive. For the UK, as we are talking, it has just been predicted that the amount of rain that normally falls within a month may fall at the end of the heat wave you're now experiencing in 2 hours. That's complete insanity. And it means it will, you know, it will mean floodings, flash floodings, and those cost people their lives. They destroy property, and they're immensely expensive. And all these reasons, and I'm not even talking about the health effects of climate change right now. And all these reasons make climate change so very expensive. And the big perspective that I write about a lot in my book is the one where we actually find a way to come to a greener economy. And those, I mean, obviously that also entails costs, right? You need to invest. But the investments, they give you so much more in return. It's just the best thing you can do right now in terms of jobs, in terms of health, clean air, you know, and even more peaceful geopolitical relations. Because right now there's still a lot of conflict over oil. And if we find a way to live with the energy of the sun and the wind, that will produce a peace dividend. So it's all these things together.
And the question of our own influence, our own individual influence, we touched on this already, but to those who say it's just negligible, so again, there's no point in us taking individual steps, what's your answer?
It's just demonstrably untrue. I mean, if I fly to the US, I mean, suppose I fly from Amsterdam to New York, right, and back. I actually calculated this once. That's as bad for the climate as eating 1,000 Big Macs, right? And I had stopped eating meat a long time ago because I don't want to cause trouble to the animals and pollute by eating meat. And actually, then why would I still go flying? And it's these sorts of very simple insights that made me see, you know, that as an individual, just by reducing certain things that you do that are polluting, you already have an impact. So that's just the first and the most simple thing that we can all do. Stop eating meat, you know, buy less stuff. If you have money invested in green funds instead of in fossil fuel companies, and there's very few people that do that consciously, but through our pensions, a lot of us are investing, and through our savings, a lot of us are investing in the fossil fuel economy. We can actually change that too. So there's all these things you can do as an individual with regards to how you consume and how you behave. And that's very important. But I think those are all like things that we need to do as a minimum. And then there's the political engagement that's needed from all of us. So we really need to be focused on what politicians in our countries are deciding about climate change right now. And they need to hear the people's voice. And actually, people have gone onto the streets in massive amounts over the past couple of years because a lot of people understand this. So the idea that you would not have any impact is just demonstratively untrue, because every time that you do something, whether it's in your own personal influence or whether it's in relation to politics, and sometimes the divide between these two things is not entirely clear. Every time you do one of those things, it will inspire others. Other people will see what you do, and it will just produce more change as a result, even if you don't become someone who goes to parties and brags about his green consumption or whatever.
It's interesting though, because these sound bites, this idea that if you take a return flight to New York, that you're doing as much damage as roughly eating 1,000 Big Macs. And that might encourage people to eat meat rather than the opposite. You see, I think I read once that if the world gave up eating beef, it would do more for the climate than if we all stopped driving, and maybe possibly if we all stopped driving and flying as well. I can't remember. But these sound bites can be helpful, but they can also be unhelpful, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I believe you're right. I mean, they can give you the idea. So, but I mean, so many people are eating Big Macs, then what does it matter if I fly to New York or whatever? There's all sorts of ways that you can bend this argument to basically do nothing. I completely understand, but the point is, with climate change, unfortunately, it's not an either or situation. It's not like we can either stop flying or stop eating meat or engage with politics so that we can make sure that in the next 10 years, which is what the IPCC is saying, that in the next 10 years, we halve global emissions, because that's what we need to do. It's not like we can just pick one of those things and do that solely. We need to do all those things together. So when you say, well, you know, I'd rather eat meat and a lot of meat, or I'd rather drive an SUV but not eat beef anymore, it's just the kind of argumentation that leaves out the fact that emissions need to go to zero.
So I think we're learning a lot by addressing people's problems with climate change. So we're sort of almost doing it in reverse, but I hope it's helpful. This brings us on to hypocrisy, of course, and you address that because, I mean, I saw it actually on TV once. I think Piers Morgan, who's a prominent British presenter here, tackled George Monbiot, who's a climate change activist and writer for The Guardian, and accused him of hypocrisy because I think he was wearing leather shoes. And you address precisely that sort of example in the book. So how do we avoid being called hypocrites if we are trying to do our little bit?
You know, perfection is not the point of making your consumption greener. So when I stopped eating meat, I didn't try to be a perfect person. I didn't try to show off. And I wasn't trying to, you know, find a place of like superior morals so that I could lecture other people. That's not the point. It's not about perfection on an individual level. It's about changing society as it is right now to a situation where we can be sustainable. And in the current society we live in, it is completely impossible to live a completely, like, I don't know how you would even say it, an unpolluting life, completely clean. You can't clear your conscience completely of any pollution. And I mean, that's very unfortunate, but it also is a hint to what we should do, which is really come together and change how our society works. And, you know, when we get to that point, then actually, if we start thinking that way, the things that we can do become relatively straightforward. So take, for instance, politics. Now, one of the things that you clearly do is introduce a carbon price. And it's just a no-brainer, because if you introduce a carbon price, you make everything that is polluting to the climate more expensive, which automatically makes green alternatives cheaper and a better alternative to people. It's just a no-brainer. If you look at companies who are still investing in fossil fuel or fossil fuel related activities, it's a no-brainer that they should stop investing in that way and actually get on the bandwagon of the green economy, because that's where the new money is being made. So if you're coming from a business perspective, it's completely clear that you should join this movement. And even as an individual, If you eat a lot of meat, it's not good for your health. If you fly around the world a lot, you can really ask yourself, you know, is that the way I want to spend my time? Is that the best quality I can get for my time? What about nature close to my home? And actually, during the Corona crisis, I think a lot of people experienced this, that they could enjoy their own surroundings. I mean, it may have been a bit too much, but I think we learned lessons in that way too.
How do we get the balance right, Jelmer, between reinforcing this message, driving home this message that we are in an extreme situation, but also not shaming people? I mean, the way that you handle this, I think is very impressive, because you're not aggressive in your approach. Philip Limbury, who's the CEO of Compassion World Farming as well, he's not trying to convert us all overnight to becoming vegans like he is. He wants probably for us to eat less meat, and certainly to eat less meat, but he's very interested in the quality of life of animals. And he's not here to shame us. So how do we get that balance right in tone?
I think actually a lot of people who are doing sustainable things aren't trying to shame other people. I think most of the time that somebody brings up the fact that you still may be wearing leather shoes or whatever, it's people who feel attacked by the fact that you have made a choice, being an ethical one or one that you just find more rational than continuing on the path that we were on. And they feel attacked, so they attack you. And actually, I think the only people that may be effective to shame are the CEOs of large oil and gas corporations, and like the politicians who are completely ignoring the problem, or even just saying it isn't true. I mean, it may be effective to make sure that they don't have a good reputation, and that they are not seen as respected players in society, so that they have less political clout and less power. And actually, that's interesting. It's one of the main motivations of the divestment movement. So I write about this in the book. The divestment movement has come from American universities, actually, where students try to find out how they could change their university's approach to climate change. And they actually found out that a lot of universities in the US invest in things like coal mining. And they came up with a very simple plan. What if we just ask the board of the university to get rid of those investments in coal mining, and put out a press release saying that they have gotten rid of those investments and that they will reinvest the money in green alternatives. That will make the reputation of these coal companies worse, and it will make them less powerful. It will make their lobbying less powerful. And in this indirect way, we will have an effect on climate change. And actually, it's been a tremendous success. So this divestment movement, which began in the US, spread over the world. And it's no longer just a thing for activists. It's a thing that has begun to affect mainstream investors. Like the biggest investment firms in the world are trying to get rid of their fossil fuel investments. And that's just one example that goes to show you that if you try something close to home and you get really active and you focus on one particular part of this problem, and you come up with a solution, that actually it always has knock-on effects, like the effects I described in the climate situation, where, you know, more heat in the atmosphere does something to the severity of a heat wave that you're experiencing. These indirect effects and these links are everywhere around us, and that's actually a reason to be hopeful, because it means that when we do something, we have actually a bigger effect sometimes than we can know.
You also talk about, or address the idea that there are too few of us really to make change happen. And yet you say that there are lots who care. And one of the areas that is really important here, I think you suggest, is law. There are lawsuits at the moment about protecting the earth. And in fact, some of the research you have done into the oil industry is being used or has been used in lawsuits itself. So just very briefly, give us a bit more on the role that the law has to play in all this.
Yeah. Well, I think every time I talk about this, people are like, the law? It's such a, you know, it's such an unlikely candidate for a climate revolution, basically. But I mean, the law is very effective. It can be very effective because if you make a good case in a court of law, and you win the argument, then you immediately have real impact. And so actually, I'll give a specific example. This happened in the Netherlands, where I'm from, and actually it's the most successful climate court case that has ever been done. And it was a very simple thesis. It started from the point of saying that the Dutch government has already signed climate treaties internationally since the 90s. And every time they put their signature under a climate treaty that said, we do not want dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. And they signed another treaty where they said dangerous is 2 degrees. And then they signed one which said, actually, if we want to avoid that, then the rich countries in the world need to make sure that they emit 25% less at the minimum in 2020, this year. And so the Dutch government had signed all these things, and they were not made into laws in our country, but they were indirectly pointing to what was deemed responsible behavior for a government in this particular debate. So this climate lawyer, Roger Cox, who actually worked with Urgenda, which is a climate organization here in the Netherlands, he just looked at this and he said, well, clearly the government knows what it has to do, but also clearly they're not doing what they think, what they've actually signed for. So they're neglectful. You know, they're not doing what they themselves say they need to do to protect people in the Netherlands from dangerous climate change. And so with that thesis, he went to the court. And actually the organization that he did this lawsuit with, and the lawyer, Koos van den Berg, also of Urgenda, who he did this lawsuit with, they won 3 times in a row. So in all stages of appeal, the Dutch government every time went into appeal, and every time they lost. In the final instance, Urgenda actually won on the count of human rights, because it is a human right to be able to live your life without, for instance, avoidable harm to your home. It's a very simple principle. You know, if someone is building a dangerous sort of chemical factory on the other side of the street, then I can sue him, and the government will have to stop him from what he's doing because it's dangerous to my home. And the same principle applies here. The government needs to make sure that the people in this country can live their life safely and humanely. And for that to be realistically, we need to do at least what the government itself has said that needs to be done in these international climate negotiations. So, and that's just a beautiful argument, I think. And actually it has worked very well in the Netherlands, and it has been copied in other countries, same sort of lawsuits. In the US, there's tons of lawsuits going on right now. They usually focus on nuisance of climate change, so that there's negative effects to your home or to your livelihood. And it's not just governments being sued now, it's also, for instance, oil and gas companies. Shell, the one company that I published internal documents from that were leaked to me a few years ago, those are now being used in lawsuits against the company because the same argument applies. Why would Shell, a big oil and gas company, be free to do something which they know is dangerous? You just can't do that. So
let's just recap on where we are. I mean, you talk of droughts, you talk of extreme heat, you talk of floods, you talk of disappearing land, you talk of real problems with crops and their sustainability. We know, I think, that there is an argument that we only have 60 or so harvests left at this rate. So there's a real problem with the soil as well. And yet you say it's not too late.
Right.
And you talk in the book of the importance of storytelling. You give us an example, the fact that we tell ourselves in the West that it's okay to eat pigs, but not dogs. And yet in some parts of the world, people eat dogs just as happily as we eat pigs. So it's about how you frame an argument, the story that you tell. What story should we be telling ourselves about climate change?
Actually, when you watch the climate news, when you watch politicians on TV, you may have the idea that we're doing far too little. But behind the headlines, there's actually a worldwide movement that's growing and that is showing that we are the ones who decide what our future looks like. And the revolution I described in various parts of society, in finance as a result of the divestment movement, in policy as a result of lawsuits, but also of activism, that revolution is already underway. It's driven by consumers who consume differently. It's driven by citizens who engage with politics. It's driven by politicians who get the problem and do something. And so in whichever part of society you start to look seriously, you will find that people are trying to deal with it. They're not always succeeding. It's always hard, but they are trying and they're getting more successful every day. And then there's technology. So I write a lot about this in the book, actually. And I already mentioned quickly solar and wind energy, which have become so much cheaper. And those actually give us the technological tools as well to really tackle this problem. I also already mentioned the economic argument, right? That it's cheaper to deal with the problem than to let it happen. And so all these bits are falling in line and the momentum is growing. And so the story I think we need to tell ourselves is that if we worry about this problem and if we find a way to contribute to the solutions, we're not alone. We're part of this global movement. And actually every contribution that we make adds up to all the other people who are doing stuff and who are finding ways to solve this.
Jelmer, we're running out of time and I want to include some audience questions as well. So if I can ask you just very, very quickly to run through some quite important points that you do bring up that we haven't properly touched on so far, just so that we can address them at least partially. One example of those points is the half measures that are being employed at the moment. And the word biofuel goes hand in hand with half measures. So just explain the danger of half measures.
Well, half measures give us the idea that we're tackling the problem while we're actually making it worse. Biofuels are the best example, things like palm oil or burning chips of wood in coal plants actually makes the problem worse often because it causes more emissions than even burning fossil fuels, which is quite an achievement. So half measures, I describe various sorts of them in the book, are sort of technological fixes that give us the idea that we can really get this under control without any major changes. And they are completely unrealistic because if we really want to change, how society is shaped, problem, then we need much bigger interventions. And these half measures, basically one way of recognizing them, and stop me if I'm going on too long, is if they don't hurt anybody close to you in any way, they don't affect you at all, so you don't see these solutions, but still people tell you that they're real and that they're very seriously helping us solve the problem. So if we're cutting down forests in Indonesia and replacing them with palm oil plantations and then making that palm oil into fuel that we burn here in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and people tell you that that's a solution, it's very unlikely. And just from reasoning, you should get that message.
And emission compensation, good or bad?
Well, if you are a very frequent flyer for some reason, I would say stop it. I mean, if you can, stop flying. You could, during Corona, you could still do a lot of work. So really, look at yourself seriously. Do you need to fly that much? But if there's stuff that you really need to fly for instance, your family lives abroad and you really want to see them a couple of times a year, I mean, it's understandable. And you have no alternative for flying, then of course you should offset those emissions. And I think not just once, but actually tenfold, so that you have a realistic chance that the money you're spending on these offsets will actually be used to protect a patch of forest land or to give people a sustainable income who are protecting that land. And it's, of course, it's better than not doing it, but you need to find the right projects. In my book, I describe where you can find them.
We've talked about rich and poor, and the fact that the poor are likely, as is often the case and has probably been the case with coronavirus as well, will get hit hardest. What about the sort of middle? I mean, how complacent or not can, say, the middle classes, loosely speaking, in Holland or Britain be about climate change in the coming decades? Again, just very briefly.
I think it's very hard. I'm not gonna judge a middle class completely. But if I just look at my own surroundings, what is telling to me is the enthusiasm with which people returned to pubs the minute they could after Corona, you know, and the enthusiasm that we all have, the enthusiasm with which people then went on holidays using airplanes right after Corona, as if they had not thought for a minute about what this crisis meant, about our interconnectedness, our vulnerability, and the fact that exactly these concepts are needed to deal with climate change. So to me, you know, that is clearly a sign that people want to return to this bubble of comfort, this false bubble of comfort as quickly as they can, is really a sign that they're complacent and looking away.
But do the middle classes stand to lose as well?
Of course. I mean, a lot of countries are already poorer now than they would have been in a world without climate change. And it's especially people who do jobs outside, like working on the land, you know, collecting garbage, whatever, police, all these people will be affected. They have to work in the heat. And, you know, it's just unbearable at times, and it will get worse.
How quickly can we change? You give examples of the book of how speedily things were put into operation in, for example, the Second World War, and you're quite optimistic about that.
Well, I mean, you could see it in the Corona crisis as well, right? Very quickly, governments were able to shelf out huge amounts of money. So apparently the argument that we could not loan money to do certain things, apparently it didn't apply anymore. And the same is true of really big crises that we experience as such. Then it always, you know, history always shows that we can change very quickly. And so, of course, I believe that we can. And I think, you know, the Second World War is the example I use in the book. But there have been other very quick shifts, and they don't always need to be as disruptive as Corona. I'm not arguing for another Corona crisis. I think a lot of the things we can do will actually improve our lives, will improve the connectivity we have to each other, improve our health and our well-being. And really, and actually, the largest part of my book is about that, right? It's about how we can make the world better still, even though we are dealing with this climate change. Correct.
You've spoken about solar power, you've spoken about wind. How confident are you in technology as a mechanism for making things better?
Well, I think we've always used technology as humanity to progress, you know, from the earliest days where we found tools to do things that apes couldn't do. And I think we're still doing that. And the point is to critically evaluate which technologies really help and which ones don't. And we have to be honest that there is no technology without downsides. It just doesn't exist. Even solar panels, wind turbines, there's always downsides. You know, we need to mine materials to make them. We need to upgrade the grid. That costs a lot of scarce materials as well. It will cost money. So it's not like there's a magic bullet in technology, but there is progress in the sense that a lot of these solutions, and not the half measures I just described, not biofuels in my opinion, but a lot of these solutions are actually much better than the situation we're in now, where we're taking oil, gas, and coal from the ground, burning them, getting sick in the process, changing the climate very quickly, and depleting the Earth's resources. It's just completely unsustainable.
And forests can play a role, but they're by no means a silver bullet.
No, I mean, no, there is no silver bullet. That's the point. It's not either or. We have to do all the things I described, unfortunately. And if you hate me for it, I'll just hide behind the fact that I didn't come up with this. It just follows from the idea that emissions need to go to zero. So you need the technology, you need economic change, you need political change, and you also need, of course, you need to invest in solutions from nature itself. I mean, forests are one of the most effective living systems in drawing carbon from the air and keeping it there, keeping it in the soil, keeping it in the wood. So it's a no-brainer again that if you plant a forest, then you should just leave it there, leave it to sequester more carbon. And so, yeah, nature can really be our ally. And I think there's a lot of natural climate solutions that we have just started understanding the potential of. And actually, that's a very hopeful perspective as well.
On that point, in this general area, Cassia in the Q&A is asked, where do you find trusted projects to offset your carbon footprint?
There are certificates like the gold standard that you can look up on the internet, and they sort of, they give you a minimum sense of security that the project you're investing in will actually go where you want the money to go, and that it's serious in its potential to sequester carbon or to keep carbon from going up in the air. Actually, personally, I think the best thing is to look for projects where you also support people, support local communities who stand to win in some way by protecting forests, for instance, or by doing agroforestry or like agriculture combined with forestry and stuff like that.
I want to get a sense of the power of the collective and whether we can come together as a world. The response to coronavirus has been somewhat fragmented. We're a polarized globe at the moment, and
right.
We've got leaders who cleave to populism. Nationalism has become a huge thing again. And I wonder how effectively we can come together as a world population to protect our species and, of course, all the other species that are affected by our actions.
Yeah, that's one of the things that worries me the most, you know, and that I'm thinking about the most is our potential for collective decision-making in a good way. So how can we reform democracies, I think is the question, to my mind at least. How can we reform democracies so that we produce better climate policies, and not just as an end to itself, but that we get to this world of sustainability and more peaceful geopolitical relationships, more health, and all the other benefits that I described, more jobs, etc. So how do we reform democracies? And actually, I think there's a lot of interesting experiments going on in that sense. I think if you look at France and even in the UK, there was the House of Commons in the UK asked a group of 108 randomly selected citizens from all over society, from all layers of society, from all educations, background, ages, to come up with climate policies. They will table their proposals in September. And actually, I think you will see that if you ask the people to seriously consider what is going on with the climate change, to be able to inform themselves, and they were guided through this process by independent gatekeepers. And you will see that they come up with very good policies. The same happened in France recently. So I think actually, as a collective, we are very good at making good decisions if we're put in a situation where we can do that. Now, voting is a very poor means of being involved in politics. You know, it's just a one-off vote. Brexit was the worst example. It's yes or no. But if you give people like serious responsibility and you ask them to seriously deliberate amongst themselves and try to find common ground, they are actually very capable of doing that. So even on this front, I'm actually quite hopeful. But I'm not saying that it will all be fine. You know, I've described a lot of things that I think one can be hopeful about, but we're still not there. You know, we're still emitting much more carbon than we need to. And the big question, I think there's a revolution going on already, but the big question is how we can make it bigger, more successful, and, you know, that it produces results much quicker. Because, as I said, I don't believe in the climate apocalypse. I don't believe that if we do too little, we will just fall off a cliff somehow, or that, you know, the end times will come and it will be a lot of storms and sea level rise. It won't be that easy. The point is that we will have to live with the consequences of our actions. And so every month right now matters, especially this moment where we are spending so much money to get out of the economic crisis after Corona. Especially now, you know, every little bit matters, and we really need to come together to give this problem our best.
And I wonder how effective you feel that activists have been of very different sorts. And you think on the one hand, say, of Greta Thunberg and her campaign. You think of Extinction Rebellion. Romy has got in touch in the Q&A to say that they staged a very effective protest in London. How effective is climate change activism at the moment? It comes in so many different shapes and forms.
Yeah, it does. And I can't speak to the effectiveness of each and every form in this short time. And I think activism sometimes has downsides. It can put people off. But on the whole, like, it's clearly very effective. And it's actually something that we should all engage in, I think. I went to the last biggest climate strike here in the Netherlands. Obviously, you should just go. I mean, it doesn't cost you anything. You can just go there and show that you are someone who supports more serious policies. And I think, you know, then there are groups who take this further, who like Extinction Rebellion, who stage sort of sit-ins on, you know, transit points in the city, or and there's all sorts of arguments for or against those kinds of actions. I think on the whole they are very, very effective, and I think citizens sort of disobeying the order and trying new things and new tactics, as long as they're non-violent, which is the crux, that's the most important thing. As long as they're non-violent, history shows them to be very effective. And actually that's what I meant when I wrote that you only need a small group of people to change the world. It's actually because a small group of people can change the conversation, they can draw arguments to their side and really change the outcomes of elections. And just look at the US. It's the best example. So the Sunrise Movement is this youth movement for climate action. And they managed in a couple of years to change the conversation that was happening in the US. And they've managed to make sure that Joe Biden now has a more progressive climate agenda than Bernie Sanders did 4 years ago as a candidate. Things are really moving very fast. And I think that's one of the things we can be hopeful about.
You talk of the power of small changes, and that's pointing the finger, but not aggressively, at each and every one of us. As we've already touched on, we can all do our little bit, and it can all add up. But David brings up an important point. Again, something we have engaged with a little bit. He says, yes, we need carbon taxes, but how can we convince our politicians to show leadership and courage? How do we as individuals make change on that scale beyond demonstrating, or is it about getting out and about with our placards?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of getting out and about and protesting, voting for the people that really get this issue and really, will strive for really good policies when they're in parliament or when they're elected. Trying to take part in experiments that renew democracy, like the experiments I just described. And in the UK specifically, when in September, the group of citizens that has been put in the position to deliberate climate policies and come up with new kinds of recommendations, when they will table their proposals, what will the rest of the population do? Will it just be one news story in a couple of newspapers and will that be it? Or will people make sure by, sending letters to members of parliament or making noise within a political party that actually these measures will be adopted? And I think it's often it's quite simple. Just get in touch with someone from your local council. Talk to them about this. Keep talking about it. I think it's every bit matters.
Jelmer, Samantha says it's rare to hear someone talk about and draw links between climate crisis and human impact. It's usually very loosely touched upon and about future generations without going into too much depth. This is refreshing to hear discussed in this conversation. Do you have examples of good organizations leading in this way?
I think 350.org was an organization that really changed the debate about finance and about the idea that I described about divestment in the US especially, but then also globally. So 350.org is a good organization, and I think all climate organizations, all big ones, including things like Greenpeace, they've all made these links between social well-being, fighting racism, fighting segregation, and fighting for a better, more livable climate, because all of these things are interrelated.
John, I want to finish by just getting a sense of how optimistic you really are about all this. I mean, where do you predict we will be in 2100?
No, I'm sorry, I don't do predictions. In my book, I go out of my way to describe two possible worlds, not in 2100, by the way, but in 2050. And you can see if you read them, they are scenarios, they're completely different worlds with very different outcomes in terms of what kind of leadership do we have, what kind of leaders, what kind of economies do we have, how sustainable will we be, how clean will our air be, how peaceful will our relationships be, how equitable will our societies be. I mean, all these things are related to climate change and to fighting it. I think to give some sort of answer to your question, I think the worst case scenario is very unlikely and the best case scenario is very unlikely too, because in reality, the two scenarios I just described and I described in my book, they are fighting with each other. This is about power. It's about shaping the future. And there are people on the frankly wrong side of the argument, who are arguing for more oil because we definitely need it a little while longer. And there are people on the good side of the argument who know, and it's been shown plenty of times, that we can transition very quickly. And, you know, it's up to any of us, and all of us actually, to join that conversation and to practice our own power, both politically and as consumers, to change the outcome of that battle. And it's quite monumental, actually, when you think about it like that.
Jelmer, there is certainly room for hope, and I'm so impressed by the fact that you engage with how bleak things might be and will be if we don't change, but also that there is an optimism and there is a hope, even if you're not prepared to make outrageous predictions one way or the other. It's been great to spend the last hour with you. Thank you so much for joining us at the How To Academy. I really recommend your book. It's absolutely fantastic. It's essential reading, really, for the climate of our time. So thank you to you. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening on a sweltering evening in London and in Amsterdam, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, for this How To Academy event. We've got lots more events throughout August, and then of course a huge schedule coming up for you in September and the autumn more generally. Please do support the How To Academy. Sign up to these events. We've given so many of them to you for free. They're not very expensive moving forward, but we are going to be asking you to make a contribution of sorts. Thank you to everybody. Thank you again so much to Jelmer Mommers. It's been absolutely brilliant. And stay safe, everyone. Stay well and have a wonderful week.